Today's program features.
Well, most honored veterans and members of the club, I bring you greetings today from the brave people of Baltimore, Maryland, and the defenders of Fort McHenry, all the way back to 1814. And I really want to thank the program committee and both Jerry Worrells for giving me the opportunity to bring this program to you. I'm a history buff. I don't know if any of y'all know that, but I love history. I've done a lot of history programs for the club, and this is one of the ones that I love the most because it's about a subject that most people don't know much about. In 2012, I visited Fort McHenry on a business trip and to Baltimore, and was very, very moved by what I learned there about this little remembered episode in our early conflicts with Great Britain. So if we can, let's roll the photos. These are photos that I took while I was there. And these are actually Civil War cannons. Last time I presented this, I was dressed like he was. Now, as a matter of fact, the War of 1812 through 1814 is called our Second War for Independence, and indeed it really was. It was also called the Forgotten War for its relative obscurity in our nation's collective memory. Now, it was a war that, in the words of one historian, quote, forged the destiny of a continent for 200 years to come. In just a minute, I'm going to pull back the curtain of time and show you a short video about the Battle of Baltimore and Fort McHenry. In 1812, Baltimore was one of our busiest seaports and critical to commerce in all 15 American states, the whole United States at the time. Allow me to set the stage for you about what was happening in Europe and in the United States at that time. It was 1812, and we had won our independence from Great Britain many years before in 1782, about 30 years before to be precise. But the resentments of the British were at this young upstart nation were still simmering below the surface. Britain had quite naturally become our largest trading partner after the war, and we were now an independent but still very weak group of states, and trade was our lifeblood as we struggled to build a country and a national economy. On the continent of Europe, Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of France, was engaged in a vicious struggle for dominance with England, a struggle for economic, political, and military dominance on the continent, but also on the high seas. In 1812, the same year that Napoleon staged his fateful and disastrous march on Moscow, that struggle spilled over to our shores and initially took the shape of both British and French naval efforts to stop the young American nation from trading with the other power and with neutral powers in Europe. As a young country of essentially traders, merchants, and farmers, we tried to stay out of that fight and insisted on our right to trade with whomever we so chose. But the British and French didn't quite see our neutrality as very helpful. Now, in order to stop trade with America, or stop American trade with enemies of Britain, the British began issuing a series of decrees requiring all ships to stop in Great Britain and pay a duty. They ultimately imposed a formal blockade on American ports like Baltimore and on the high seas began stopping and seizing American merchant ships and cargo. And, this was the worst part, forcibly drafting many of our young merchant sailors into immediate service in the British Navy. This was a horrendous practice called impressment. It was literally the kidnapping and taking off of American ships thousands of our countrymen. Now, Britain had about 120,000 men at sea, and were losing about 10 to 15,000 a year due to death, disease, or desertion. So to continue losing manpower at that rate, that would have severely threatened Britain's ability to confront the French. So impressment was actually a way for the British to replenish their manpower, and it was a pretty heavy-handed solution, but it was effective for a time. Service in the British Navy was almost uniformly brutal, ugly, and certainly unpleasant. Sailors were treated very poorly, discipline was extraordinarily harsh, and living conditions were just awful, especially if you were a new recruit. In the years leading up to the war, the British seized between 5,000 and 9,000 of our sailors for duty in the British Navy. Needless to say, this was an affront to our sovereignty, was horribly disruptive to our trade and commerce, our morale, and our sense of national dignity. It was also a huge contributor to the election in 1810 of a new group of members of Congress called the War Hawks. And these newly elected members advocated going to war with Britain over all of this and other insults to our national rights. Now, while this group saw a military confrontation with Great Britain as inevitable, they also hoped that the conflict would result in American seizure of Canada and national expansion west into the areas where the Indian tribes still lived and roamed. Now, when Congress finally declared war on Great Britain in 1812, President James Madison explained that repeated diplomatic discussions with the British over these issues of impressment and fair trade had proven useless. He said Britain still refused, quote, to yield to the claims of justice or renounce the errors of a false pride, unquote. And it was so. Britain had never really gotten over its humiliating loss of the colonies, and in fact, the hostilities that I've referred to was really psychologically a sort of continuation of the first war, the Revolutionary War, and a byproduct of its continuing conflict with France, which is the country that helped us in the Revolutionary War. Now, most of the Indian tribes during this conflict sided with the British. Most of them were bribed by British promises of wealth and things that the tribes cared about. Not all Indian tribes sided with the British, but most did. And ultimately that cost them their lands and destroyed their ability to prevent the very western expansion that they feared. Now, interestingly, the War of 1812 initially was as controversial in the United States as had been the Revolutionary War in the 13 colonies. One of those who actually, and this is one of the rich ironies of history, one of those who actually opposed the war was a Baltimore lawyer you may have heard of named Francis Scott Key. Key was 35 at the time and had considered becoming a preacher before he finally decided on the law. Key initially thought the War of 1812 was, quote, an abominable war, and he said he was repulsed by the fact that the start of the war, quote, was received with public rejoicings in his hometown of Baltimore. Now, to take American military pressure off of its colonies in Canada and to force this young upstart government to defend the American homeland proper, the British started to do two things. They first armed and incentivized American Indian tribes on our western frontier to stage what amounted to terrorist attacks on towns and villages and trading routes. And the second thing they did was they began terror raids all along our Atlantic coast and on port cities like Washington, D.C. and Baltimore. Now, the British raided Washington, D.C. because they knew it was lightly defended. And in fact, the U.S. Secretary of War, General John Armstrong, had been focused on prosecuting the Canadian campaign of the United States and had virtually ignored the fact that a British admiral, George Cockburn, had been raiding Chesapeake Bay town since 1813. The British reasoned that attacking American ports and centers of government might draw the American army back out of Canada to defend the 15 states. And they were right about this. In a way, this British attack on Washington was actually payback for our having raided the Canadian cities of York and Toronto. The British occupied Washington for about a day. They set the White House on fire and a few more fires in the city, and then returned to the British ships and sailed back out into the Atlantic, bound for Baltimore, where they intended to, as they said, quote, deal with that nest of pirates. Well, while Washington was our capital city, Baltimore was the big prize for the British because of its commercial importance. This brings us to the Battle of Baltimore and Fort McHenry, which was then guarding the approach to this American center of commerce. On September 12, 1814, a huge, menacing force, British force of 16 ships of the line, approached the fort and the entrance to Baltimore Harbor beyond. Now, there were about 10,000 citizens in Baltimore to defend the town and about 1,000 men defending the fort itself. The people of Baltimore were in an understandable panic at the approach of the British because they had already gotten word about the sacking of the White House and the fires set in Washington, D.C., which was a relatively short distance away. But they were equally determined that the British would not burn their city. They would defend it at all costs, and they organized to dig a mile-long trench and build breastworks on the eastern side of the city to defend against a land approach by the British up the peninsula leading to Baltimore. They reasoned that the fort would protect them on the harbor side, and they would block the British on the land side. So let's roll the video and come back with me to a very dangerous time and place.
That star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. Powerful words from our national anthem. They speak to our American identity and are woven into our national flag. Timeless words written by one man, Francis Scott Key, about one flag at one moment. September 14th, 1814, here at Fort McHenry. In 1812, the storm clouds of war had gathered over a young United States as the nation pitted itself once more against the might of the British Empire. For 2 years, the conflict wore on, from the British colonies of Canada to America's southern coast and out across the high seas. To draw off U.S. forces from Canada and damage America's economy and morale, the British Navy attacked and blockaded the nation's East Coast heartland. Up and down the Chesapeake Bay they raided, destroying towns and farms and spreading fear. Then, in August 1814, disaster. The invading British seized Washington, D.C., and burned the nation's capital. A citizen soldier of Baltimore spoke for many.
Every American heart is bursting with shame and indignation at the catastrophe.
And Baltimore hearts were also full of anxiety, for they feared they would be next.
Citizens of Baltimore, take heed. The British fleet approaches. Admiral Coburn has declared that he will burn this nest of pirates. If you can, flee the city. Take your valuables. Protect your families, gentlemen.
As Baltimore braced itself, a young Maryland lawyer, Francis Scott Key, embarked on a diplomatic mission to free a prisoner of war, sailing right into the heart of the approaching British fleet. But with their attack on Baltimore imminent, the British detained Key amidst their massing warships. On the outskirts of Baltimore, citizens, men and women, militia, and regular troops desperately prepared defenses. They dug almost a mile of earth entrenching and waited with bated breath. On September 12th, British soldiers landed at North Point, where a bloody battle with Maryland militia failed to halt their march towards Baltimore. However, the British could not tackle the city's earthwork defenses and troop reinforcements without their Navy's help. The next day, the British bomb ships would open up their main assault with a ferocious bombardment. Their target, Fort McHenry. They had to knock out the fort to bring their ships in range of the city. The fate of Baltimore now lay in the hands of the fort's defenders.
Move quickly there!
1,000 soldiers frantically prepared for battle, knowing they were the last defense to thwart the British. With the enemy in their sights, the men awaited the inevitable, a bombardment from the world's most formidable navy. Then the attack began as the British fleet pounded the fort with rockets and mortar shells. Turned into rain-soaked night. But still, the British bombs and rockets thundered over the fort, exploding deadly shrapnel in all directions. The fort's defenders were, in the words of one citizen soldier, like pigeons tied by the legs to be shot at. The American artillery answered the British with desperate return fire. But would it be enough? Baltimore's citizens watched in panic through the night. One recalled,
"The attack on Fort McHenry was distinctly seen from Federal Hill, and from the tops of houses which were covered with men, women, and children."
Early next morning, September 14th, the British guns finally fell silent. A huge flag was raised above the fort, but whose? Through the long night, Francis Scott Key had been forced to watch the bombardment from among the enemy fleet.
Not at all.
Nothing.
Now, he strained to see the flag in the dawn's early light.
It's ours, Mr. Skinner.
Jose, we've won.
It's ours.
Inspired by their courage, Key wrote down a few lines. "'Tis the star-spangled banner, oh long may it wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave." As the British withdrew, Key returned to Baltimore, where his words soon found music and a publisher, and the Star-Spangled Banner was born. It captured a defiant, patriotic spirit and spread rapidly across the nation, pouring new life into the national flag as a symbol of American identity. The popularity of the song and the flag grew during the years that followed. The Star-Spangled Banner eventually became the official anthem of the United States in 1931. Inspired by the brave defense of Fort McHenry, Francis Scott Key's words and the flag they so memorably portray are now woven into our sense of national identity. These words still resonate as loudly today as the glaring rockets and bursting bombs of 1814.
Now, you wonder, why was Francis Scott Key on a British ship watching all of this? And he had actually gone out to the British to ask for the release of a Dr. Beans, William Beans, who was a doctor and administered to both British troops and American troops and sick soldiers on both sides after the Revolutionary War. And Dr. Beans had been arrested by a British general and had been taken to the ships. And so he went out there on a peace mission. He met with President Madison. Madison says, "I want you to go to Baltimore and find John Skinner, our prisoner of war negotiator, and you all go together and see if you can get Dr. Beans released." And so they were on the ship trying to negotiate this with the British admiral, but the British obviously would not release them prior to the battle because they didn't want him tipping off the Americans. So he was trapped on this ship temporarily. It's very interesting. There's a little side story which I find fascinating. When Key and Skinner was brought to the admiral's flagship, they were about to sit down to dinner. And so the admiral very graciously invited them to sit down and join them for dinner. And the forced polite conversation really didn't take long to go downhill. With one officer insulting America and Skinner responding in kind. Key later wrote that, quote, "Never was a man more disappointed in his expectations than I have been as to the character of British officers. With some exception, they appeared to be illiberal, ignorant, and vulgar, and seemed filled with a spirit of malignity against everything American," unquote. So Skinner and Key met with the Admiral General Ross actually said, "Well, let's visit privately." General Ross agreed to release Dr. Beans, but retained them or detained them on the ships throughout the battle. Key later wrote about his captivity on the ship prior to the attack, saying, quote, "To make my feelings still more acute, the admiral had intimated his fears that the town of Baltimore must be burned, and I was sure that if taken, it would have been given up to plunder, and it was full of women and children." Now, what the video doesn't reveal is that the Baltimore defenders sank 11 smaller ships across the mouth of the inlet leading into the harbor to prevent the British ships from sailing up. And a line of armed barges also protected the harbor. Citizens surrendered pickaxe, wagons, all potential kinds of barriers to this effort. Jane Hampton Cook, in her book on the battle, writes, "An American commander, John Rogers, who wrote proudly, 'Forts, redoubts, and entrenchments are thrown up all around the town, and the place now has nothing to fear, even should the enemy make his appearance tomorrow.'" Now, they also linked a huge chain, mast to mast, across the river with 5 to 10 gunboats behind that, with cannons trained downriver at the approaching British. On September 12th, and this is an interesting part of the story, British General Robert Ross, who's the one, remember, that set fire to the White House in Washington, was landed with 4,000 men who marched up the peninsula, and then shortly after landing, they ran into an American scouting party, and one of our teenage American sharpshooters killed the experienced British commander outright. Command then passed to a much less experienced officer who led them to the outskirts of Baltimore itself, where they were met with musket and cannon fire by the citizen soldiers in the trenches that had been hurriedly dug. Meanwhile, as the drama unfolded, coming urgently to the defense of the city were some 30,000 Americans from villages and farms all over the place in the rural areas, flooding into the city, determined to prevent Baltimore from being, and Maryland for that matter, from being subjugated by these British raiders. Feelings of fear, anger, and determination were running very high on the American side. Then Congressman Charles Ingersoll wrote, quote, "The immediate and enthusiastic effect of the fall of Washington was an electrical revival of national spirit and universal energy. The attack on Washington was an attack not against the strength or the resources of a state, but against the national honor and public affections of a people," close quote. Now, initially, the British fleet stood off about 2 miles from Fort McHenry and sent these exploding Congreve rockets and cannonballs mercilessly into Fort McHenry. It's been estimated that between 1,400 and 1,800 shells fell on Fort McHenry, the equivalent of about 133 tons of explosive. Can you imagine being on the receiving end of that, with bombs overhead exploding, throwing shrapnel everywhere? And believe it or not, there were only 4 fatalities in Fort McHenry from that exchange. Now, the bombardment was so great that they could hear it in Philadelphia 100 miles away to the west. The American fort's cannons, however, had only a 1-mile range, and they could not effectively hit the British ships, so it was a pretty one-sided battle initially until the British tried to stage a end run around the left side of the port, not the side that leads to the harbor, but the left side of the fort, and the British absolutely got hammered and quickly withdrew. The British fleet commander, seeing this, that he was blocked either way, finally sent word to the land forces that the Navy would be unable to support the landing party, and they were on their own. Then the inexperienced British commander of the land forces concluded that they were not going to make progress into Baltimore without the support of the Navy, and they withdrew, marching back down the peninsula and returning to the British ships, abandoning the attack on the city and giving Americans a great victory. Now, humorously, in what must have been one of the first examples of political spin, the British fleet commander, trying to put his best face on the thwarted attack, sent word to the British Admiralty that "We have demonstrated the power of the British Navy to the criminals and pirates in Baltimore, and now are off to seize the port of New Orleans," where General Andy Jackson promptly whipped their behinds 2 weeks after the war had officially ended. In 1815, the Treaty of Ghent was finally signed in Belgium, declaring a formal end to the war, but The victory of the Americans in preventing the destruction of Baltimore in late 1814 fundamentally changed the nature of the negotiations, which had been just dragging on for months. The British initially thought they were going to get to dictate the terms of the settlement. But in fact, when it became clear that the war was a stalemate, the British made the decision, we need to end this and refocus on the French. The War of 1812 lasted 2.5 years and basically resulted in a military stalemate and a political draw. But once again, the most powerful armed forces in the world, the British Empire, were blocked by a young, impertinent, upstart group of former colonies through sheer grit and determination. At the outset of the war, we had about 12,000 untrained and inexperienced troops versus a potential force of 250,000 professional British soldiers. Now, the conflict led to the creation and the utilization of large numbers of privateers, independent ship owners and military contractors, pirates, who were paid by the U.S. government to raid British ships and take the war on the seas to them. Since we had only 17 ships in the whole American Navy versus 1,048 in the British Empire. Now, ironically, most of the American victories in the war came at sea, not on the land. The land operations that we had were largely indecisive when they weren't complete disasters. The conflict was the catalyst, though, for the formation of a formal professional American Navy, and it gave real-time battle experience to a whole new generation of soldiers and sailors. Within 40 days of the Battle of Baltimore, the words to the Star-Spangled Banner were in every newspaper in the country and the Western territories. It spread, it gained in popularity, and for a long time, this song was always played on the 4th of July all over the country. In 1889, the Secretary of the Navy signed a general order making the Star-Spangled Banner the official tune to be played at the raising of the American flag. And on March 3, 1931, President Herbert Hoover signed a law passed by Congress officially designating the Star-Spangled Banner the official national anthem, and we've been singing it ever since. A British soldier writing home characterized the war as, quote, a hot and unnatural war between kindred people. And so it was. So it was a very fascinating time in our history. This was our second war for independence, and we really ought to remember the defenders, the courage of the defenders of Baltimore, all those people out there digging trenches in Baltimore, the courage of Francis Scott Key, who had several children and didn't know that he would ever return home. There was a lot of courage demonstrated that day, and the spirit of courage in those hearts remains in American hearts today. Thank you very much.
Well, I believe we have time for a couple of questions. Donald, you had your hand up first.
Yeah, I mean, great presentation. Thank you very much. I just have a question. Why did they decide just to sing the first verse and not throughout the whole song? Because, there's parts in there that you usually don't sing, especially No Refuge from the Save, The Hearing of the Slave, The Terror of Flight, The Brave. Was there some type of debate on that? Or?
You may not have heard, but Americans have very short attention span.
That's a great historical question. I don't know. I think it was probably more just a tradition that the raising of the flag is a short experience, short event. 4th of July, people are wanting to party. So I imagine that we just got to the tradition of just singing the first stanza fairly early on. I think rarely were all 4 stanzas sung, and that tradition has continued to this day at football games, etc.
Ernest?
It appears that the British really won what they were really after, and that was to keep Canada. Otherwise, it'd be the United States of Canada.
Well, they were very concerned about being able to defend Canada, and they were stretched so thin in fighting the French on the continent and on the high seas that the war hawks in Congress saw this as an opportunity to seize Canada for the United States. As it turned out, there was enough military incompetence on both sides that didn't happen. But Donald Trump made a reference the other day about Canadians raiding the United States, and it was actually the British, not the Canadians, that set the White House on fire.
The other part was we burned theirs first. Anything else?
The Canadian campaigns were very poorly managed. They were totally indecisive, and they were kind of an embarrassment in the annals of American military history.
All right. Well, Steve, in recognition and appreciation of your presentation today, the Rotary Club of Dallas has made a donation to a longtime Rotary Club of Dallas, as you know, and Rotary International Initiative for Sanitation and Safe Clean Water.
Wonderful.
And this is going to change the lives of many, many people, Steve. Thank you
Great.
very much.
Thank you.
Great presentation.
Thank you. Very nice. Thank you.
All right. Well, guests and Rotarians and those that are watching us live stream, thank you for your attendance today. We appreciate it. I want to remind you that next week will be the changing of the guard. You get rid of me. You finally get rid of me. And I know that's something you're really looking forward to. So you survived. Can't believe it. Also, the board, we have a board meeting immediately following this. So if you would please make your way that way, I would appreciate it. One other small thing. We are still shy of our goal for every member every year, an average of $120 per member. I know that you guys are saving it up for the last week, but between now and the 30th, please go online to the RI website, click donate, and donate $120. A lot of you haven't done that yet. It'll take you about 5 minutes, and surely you can spare that. So let's make our goal. Why should you do that? Well, here's the thing. If we have an average of $120 per person donated, we are in the top tier in the district for district funds being disseminated to us. And the more we are funded, the more we can spend on our grants like Ghana and Dream Team and other great projects, our hunger program, our honoring our teachers. So please take 5 minutes and make a donation on that. And now, if you would please all rise, let us say the four-way test, the things that we wish all people lived in their lives, the things that we think, say, or do. First, is it the truth? Second, is it fair to all concerned? Third, will it build goodwill and better friendship? And fourth, will it be beneficial to all concerned? And five, for our club, we are adjourned.